Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I wanted to do a video about the Doctor Who New Adventures from Virgin Books in the 1990s, which was a series that began in 91, so it's 33 years ago. It began after they ran out of TV stories to adapt, 2 years after the TV show had finished, and they were looking for things to do next. And we'd all been saying it for years, anybody who read the Target books, what we need are original stories. And in the summer of 91, the first of these books started coming out, and they seemed to arrive every 2 months, as I remember, and they weren't fast enough. I couldn't wait for the next one to come out. I couldn't believe this was actually happening. Adventures Too Wide and Broad and Deep. Stories too broad and too deep for the small screen, and that's exactly how they were. I had just finished my finals at university in the summer of 91, and I was really into epic fantasy at that point. I remember reading Guy Gavriel Kay's Tigana and John Crowley's Egypt in the kind of weeks following my finals. Everybody else that I knew went off on holiday after their exams. I had no money and I stayed in our student house and read these huge thick novels and immersed myself in fantasy. And then John Peel's first new adventure came out in the Time Worm series, Genesis. And this one was set in Mesopotamia. And it took the Doctor and Ace, who we knew from TV, into this crazy ancient world of space goddesses and warriors. And I loved it. We'd got used to the gradually darkening years of the Sylvester McCoy era, which was fascinating and difficult to watch as a student, hard to watch as a student, because nobody else I knew wanted to watch it. Now, of course, everyone says they always loved Doctor Who. A bit like David Bowie fans when Bowie died. Everybody's always loved David Bowie, and I just thought, where were you during the Glass Spider tour? And I think for people who love Doctor Who, or say they love Doctor Who, where were you during Series 24? When they kind of rebooted Doctor Who, so it became more of a kind of tea time kids show for 1987, which I thought worked brilliantly. But with the two following years, it started to get darker and darker. It kept the slightly crazy aesthetic and the wildness of McCoy's Doctor, but started underscoring it with this strange, dark mythology from old Gallifrey, and the idea of the gods of Ragnarok and Fenric moving the Doctor and his friends like chess pieces, but the Doctor having this all these ulterior motives and greater knowledge of cosmic forces. And this was gradually being filtered into the show, and by the end of Doctor Who on TV in 1989, it was extremely dark and peculiar and spooky. And then it went. But the books came along within 2 years, and they were taking us even deeper into this strange world. I love this intro by Sophie Aldred in the first one, where she, no Doctor, no Ace. That's something we all feared would happen at some point. I was heartbroken to say farewell to such a dynamic, interesting character. We never have said goodbye to the Seventh Doctor and Ace. Anyway, I'm going to go through these heaps. I haven't got all of them, never had all of them. I didn't read all of them, actually. I petered out somewhere in the mid-90s and then came back to them. And I think of this at that time as being this huge absence of Doctor Who in my life, and it wasn't. It was about a year and a half, I think. Number 2, I remember buying in Newcastle, on a trip to Newcastle. At some point in 91, later that summer, Terrance Dicks returning to the fold with Exodus, the one where the Doctor's so pally with Hitler. I must return to it and find out why and how he's so pally with Hitler. But it's part of this series of following the Time Worm through history and the damages it makes. It does. What else? The third one, Time Worm Apocalypse, by Nigel Robinson was a kind of proper space opera romp on an alien world. It's funny looking back. There were flashbacks here to one of the earlier Doctors. There were flashbacks in the first one to, I forget which Doctor, and they were like catnip for us fans then, which is really funny thinking about it now. The idea of continuity references, what they now call deep dives into lore, the lore of the show, has become, well, first of all, it became too much, and there was too much of it, and then you get a reboot where there's none of it, and then you get a slow descent into falling in love with continuity again. That seems to be the way of all franchises, that you get this disavowal of the past and an embrace of fan wank, as good old Craig Hinton used to call it. And then at the end of that year, we got Time Worm Revelation. By then, I was doing my MA in creative writing at Lancaster. And in the very first week, the very first meeting we had, we meet all the new students, all the students that we're going to be working with, and mostly they were middle-aged women doing poetry or writing memoirish novels about all the affairs they've ever had. Or people writing poems about ponies and you know, how much they hate their mothers and nature. There was a lot of that. But Paul Cornell was a student on the course as well. And I knew his name from fan fiction, and knowing this was about to come out, that he was somebody who'd been brought in from the world of fandom to write for this series. So I was amazed and that had actually worked. This appeal they put out as a publisher for people to come forward. And here was Paul Cornell doing this. So we bonded straight away on that course, and we were known as the Outer Space Boys by somebody very patronising on the course, because all I wanted to talk about, and all, I don't think he did, I think he wanted to talk about the serious novel he wanted to write on the course, and all I was doing was asking about Revelation and what it was going to be about. And I remember getting a copy of the book eventually when he did a signing in a very gloomy, scary science fiction bookshop in Lancaster, which was run by a very forbidding-looking Scotsman. The kind of bookshop where, you know, everything's stacked up against the walls, and if you dislodge anything, you get glared at, and nothing's been bought for years and years, that kind of shop. And Paul was signing these in there, and he'd produced a kind of phantasmagorical novel that went into the Doctor's head. We've seen all of this on TV since. We've seen all the elements that are in this, including up to Jodie Whittaker's last episode, where the Doctor's inside her own head, meeting her previous selves, because they're still up there giving advice and bickering. That's all in here. There's lots of elements to this that we saw later, and it's one that is worth studying further and returning to, I think. Anyway, that was the end of the first 4 novels that went together. Then there was a trilogy, and then they went monthly after that because they sold lots, I think. I think they did well. Now, the Cat's Cradle series, I'm missing one of them. I think it was... I can't think what order they came in now. This is the first. Mark Platt, who I've only met once at an event where different people had stalls. He was on the Big Finish stall and I was on the Bafflegab stall, and I went to say how much I loved his work and had done for years and years. This was in 2012, and he was very nice and kind of said how much he liked mine. And I remember Paul Darrow standing up suddenly. He'd been signing things and swearing at us and calling us lovies, just taking the piss and being hilarious about it. And it happened again later the same day. He was a great comedian, I guess, Paul Darrow, and he just took the piss. But we were so glad to see each other. This is such a strange book. It's where he can really let rip with the oddness of his imagination and take you into some very strange places indeed, which at the age of 21, 22, I was dying for Doctor Who to get into these areas of science fiction that was familiar to me from the 60s, 70s, kind of Moorcock, Aldous, Ballard, those kinds of science fiction books. suddenly to see that seriousness in Doctor Who was stonking. And I love the fact that there's some kind of evil cyborg lamprey on the front. The TARDIS is invaded by an alien presence and then it's destroyed. The Doctor disappears. Ace, lost and alone, finds herself in a bizarre deserted city ruled by the tyrannical leech-like monster known as the Process. Lost Voyagers, drawn forward from ancient Gallifrey, perform obsessive rituals in the ruins. The strands of time are tangled in a cat's cradle of dimensions. Only the Doctor can challenge the rule of the Process and restore the stolen future. But the Doctor was destroyed long ago, before time began. In lots of ways, this is a paradigmatic blurb for this book. The Doctor disappears. They all wrote the Doctor out as soon as they could. He would play, and he became a character who appeared fleetingly on the outskirts of the stories, especially in the books by Mark Platt or who else am I thinking of? Andrew Cartmel. He was a almost sinister presence on the manipulating things. But my problem with the books as they went on was that the Doctor was hardly in it, and we got Ace and Bernice in the middle, or other characters, or the world of that the writer was creating and exploring became the major part of the book, and you felt, oh, are they using the Doctor Who brand to bring their own science fiction novels in? That's what they want to do mostly. And I was happiest with the ones that struck that balance, that were original and faithful to a writer's own imagination and world, but kept the Doctor and their companions front and centre, and enjoyed playing with the Doctor Who stuff. That's not to say that I don't think this does. I think later we get into that stuff. I love this one. This is the third one. I think we have a Ben Aronovich one first. Is it Transit? No, it's not, is it? No, it's Warhead. Andrew Cartmel, which is when you go into his kind of future cyberpunk world of a decaying Earth and corporate stuff and terrorism, and it was a world he was building in his own Doctor Who books. Then we get the third one, Andrew Hunt's Witchmark, which I think is my favourite of all of the New Adventures, because it brings in fantasy elements, it has a village, it has ordinary people, and it has the Doctor and Ace interacting with ordinary people. And I think that works very well in this, the collision of dimensions and the world you glimpse beyond being bigger than you'd ever get on TV, or more convincing than you'd ever get on TV. Now, to go through they're not in order, I'm afraid. This, I think, was one of the earliest, if not the next one that came after the quadrology and the trilogy, when they went monthly. In comes Mark Gatiss with his first Doctor Who thing, Nightshade, which is a kind of Quatermass riff on the Doctor Who story itself, and I think involves, from what I remember, Susan coming back. It was very odd that I'd started this course with Paul Cornell, and so I knew somebody writing Doctor Who books, and then they tell you that somebody from my school was publishing a Doctor Who book. Mark Gatiss had been 2 years ahead of me, and I had no idea he was even interested in Doctor Who at all. So that was very odd. It's like the universe was kind of telling me something, like, you've got to get on with this and do one yourself. But for years I thought, I'm never going to do this. This is a very closed world, even though it was open, they took submissions from everywhere. I didn't feel part of fandom, of fanzines and all that world, and because I gradually realised that lots of these people had lots of experience. The new people doing these novels had lots of experience of writing for Doctor Who in fanzines and were part of that world. Gareth Roberts' The Highest Science, which I remember loving a lot, and coming to Manchester to buy Doctor Who books. I don't think they were getting them in whatever the shops were in Lancaster. I don't think Waterstones got them. I'm not sure that the Scotsman and his spooky bookshop were getting them. Or maybe they just coincided with me having trips to Manchester. But I remember coming to Manchester and seizing this. There was one copy of this in Dillon's. And whenever anybody I knew went anywhere, I would ask them to get the next Doctor Who book for me. This is the one involving his Chelonians, the tortoise people. Then Gary Russell, whose name I knew because I'd collected the audio-visual fan productions on cassette. All the people who eventually became Big Finish and BBV productions in the 90s, in the late 90s. And Gary was the person who I corresponded with to get these cassettes of these Doctor Who stories in whatever, 89, 90. And so here he was doing a Peladon novel. He was also, at some point around then, the editor of Doctor Who magazine. Ben Aronovich came in with Transit, and he was a TV writer, of course. This was very cyberpunky, and I'm getting them all out of order right now. Don't write in and say. Wasn't quite to my taste. It was getting harder edged. It was getting more, cyberpunky, very, very 90s, very 80s actually, I suppose. And Terrance Dicks was back with vampires and Chicago cops and gangsters and things, which was very enjoyable, but it seemed slightly naive, I suppose, next to the harder-edged, more sophisticated stuff that the younger people were doing. I was torn between them. I loved the new directions that things were going in, the increased sophistication, even if it took it in directions that I didn't particularly enjoy. At least it was moving on. The Terrance books were enjoyable, but they were obviously coming from a different place, a different era. Right, what else? These are well out of order. Deceit, Peter Darvill Evans. Now, this one I didn't read until quite recently, and I was put off by the first 50 pages, which I found very dense and wordy, and they didn't involve the Doctor and Ace. I think this was the point I stopped reading them for a while. In 94, 93, I took a break at this point. I was really looking forward to it. I remember buying this one in Dillon's in Waterstones, Dillon's in Manchester too. I was looking forward to it because it involved Absalom Dark, the Dalek killer character from the comics, the colliding of the comics with the novel series seemed irresistible, but I did resist it because I was bored by page 50. I'm afraid, I'm sorry, Peter Darvill Evans, but it killed it dead for me. And then, 20 years later, maybe more than that, just a couple of years ago, I sat down with it again, thinking, why was it I was taken out of this book and didn't enjoy it? I'll try again. And it gives the lie to the old thing about read the first 50 pages, and if it's not grabbing you, dump it. It never will. Page 51 in this, it suddenly picks up. So never listen to my rules. On page 51, suddenly the Doctor arrives, and the novel takes off with a whole new impetus. And I loved it. So never listen to me. Always try and finish the books you're reading. I did think that the covers were getting a bit tacky, a bit too comic strippy, and they look so dated now. Set Piece by Kate Orman. Wasn't her first. Again, it's here somewhere. Left-handed hummingbird, was her first. She's a very complicated, clever, tricksy writer who does all the tricks and the jumping in different times and tying things together. She's very intellectual, but she does it with real heart as well, I think. And so you believe in the characters and you love the characters. And I remember it being a big deal that there's a woman writing for the series. It seems so ridiculous now, but it was such a novelty And why we didn't have more women writing for the series all the way through, I don't know. It just seems ridiculous. Anyway, I remember reading this in Edinburgh. I'd moved to Edinburgh by then, post-PhD, post my first novel coming out. And I remember, maybe I was just reading them in retrospect. I think I was picking them from the library, actually. And this Cyberman one by David Banks had stuff in it I liked, but it didn't hold together as a book. So again, I felt stymied by the series. And I remember seeing Sky Pirates by Dave Stone in James Thinn's, the big fancy newsagent and bookshop in Edinburgh. I think it was James Thinn's. Anyway, on Princes Street, and being so intrigued that they were doing a kind of what looked to me as if it was going to be a Terry Pratchett type comic fantasy. And I thought that's perfect for this series. And I think I read it about then. I'm not sure, but I absolutely loved it. And always looked out for Dave Stone's books after that. There's a craziness to what he does and a very particular, very inventive aesthetic that he has. Steve Lyon's Conundrum takes us into the world of the mind robber again and the master of the land of fiction. He does this twice in 2 books, and they're complex and interesting. I think Steve Lyons is a very interesting writer, as is David McKinty. I don't think I've read this one, White Darkness. I don't know why. I think this was at the point I was dipping in and out, 93. So it's good. I've still got ones that I could return to this world for. More Gareth Roberts, Zampa, The Also People, Ben Aronovich, which probably has the most characteristic of all the covers. It's a poster, isn't it? The Doctor floating about, drinking tea in an armchair in space. It's an image almost kind of picked up again in the TV movie, actually. Another copy of Set Piece. This one I remember loving at the time, Blood Heat, Jim Mortimer. A kind of what-if adventure. Had the Silurians won back in the 1970s TV show, and a future Earth infested by Earth reptiles. I haven't read this one, Lucifer Rising. This one I remember coming out and reading more or less at the time, Human Nature, which became, again, a kind of cornerstone and a benchmark for the series. It's a kind of retelling of Superman 2, really, with the Doctor disavowing his Time Lord nature and becoming human for a while to see if he can, and falling in love. And of course they adapted it for the TV, which is interesting. I love the shuttling back and forth between TV and books and comics, and the disrupting of the canon with that. So it gives me hope that one day on TV they'll do Sick Building or whatever of mine, maybe. Cornell's No Future, his punk book, and his Love and War, the one that he wrote during the MA course. And I think the Houthai are in it because I remember us laughing and laughing on a walk to a kind of Outward Bound centre to do a creative writing weekend with all the members of the course, and we kept reciting bits of dialogue from The Brain of Morbius, and we got stuck on that line. We were yomping through the dark up this hill, through the woods, lost. We got stuck on that line by Terrance Dicks or Robin Bland, in which the high priestess of the Sisterhood of Khan says that she can sense all the spacecraft around Khan, and even the silent gas dirigibles of the Houthai are felt within our bones, which always makes me laugh. Even the silent gas dirigibles of the Houthai. And because we laughed so much at that, I think the Houthai must have stuck in his head and ended up as the monsters in this. This Sherlock novel, Sherlock Holmes Meets the Doctor novel by Andy Lane, and another Mark Gatiss, and another Kate. This is my favourite Kate Orman, where UNIT puts its the left behind monsters, the left behind invaders into a little kind of village where they have to live in secrecy. And there's an auton, a bit of the Nestine consciousness is left behind in the form of a spatula. And it's heartbreaking. It's Torchwood before its day. I think the roots of all that Torchwood stuff is in things like this. Torchwood, I have an uneasy relationship with. I was never convinced by it in any form. Some of it was enjoyable, but it was like science fiction written by 12-year-old boys, given a big budget, really. It was, yeah. But I think the version of Unit and that we see in the New Adventures, to me, is where that begins, and I wish it had been closer to that. So Vile a Sin, Ben Aronovich and Kate Orman, which I've never got to yet, and Toy Soldiers by Paul Leonard. I love these epic science fiction covers. Now, and then Russell did his Damaged Goods, and that's when it was a surprise to me, because we both sat in Pizza Express in Manchester in 1995, and he said, "Paul, are you a fan of the Doctor?" And I said, "I used to." It was like kind of the, betraying Jesus before the before the cock crows. I'm not a follower. I'm not a fan, but I used to be. And Russell said the same. And I wonder now, had we both said yes, why can't it come back on TV? I wish we'd had that conversation then. But we were very much in the closet about the Doctor. And then he came out the next year and did this very gory Manchester set novel, which is very New Adventures, but not really, to me, very Doctor Who, I don't think. But it did make me think, well, he's doing it. By then we had the TV movie, and Paul McGann was the Doctor, and the BBC books were taking it back from Virgin, and they issued their own set of guidelines and invited submissions. And I was a published novelist by then, so I was like, what the hell, I'm going to do it this time. I don't have to belong to a clique to do this. And before that, though, and before BBC books came out, and before I got to do mine, in 96, 97, we got two last wonderful hurrahs from Virgin. We got Mark Platt's Lung Barrow, which I've talked about before here, but it's his Gormenghast type novel returning to the Doctor's origins on Gallifrey, where we meet his long-lost tutor, who's a robotic badger who has one eye hanging out. And you get to meet his aunties, and again, mythology that seeps into later Doctor Who, in the Jodie Whittaker era, which astonished me. I think when we step back from all of it and watch things again, the Jodie Whittaker era will be the most like the New Adventures TV has ever got. I'm saying that now. The whole lot finished for me with Lance Parkins, The Dying Days, the whole Doctor Who in the Virgin universe, as it were. And this is a lovely summation of the whole thing, but at the centre of it, a new Doctor, given a very new Doctor-ish kind of story. He revisits the house that the Sylvester McCoy Doctor had on Earth. We have the Ice Warriors reinvented. You've got Unit and Bernice. Yeah, and it all came to an end. And the next month, I think, well, I read this in London in August 1997, it says at the front. By then, we'd already begun the BBC books. I read Lung Barrow in June 97 in Edinburgh. So between them, BBC books had gone off on its own trajectory and had begun and was taking us into the next era of Doctor Who, which I was going to be part of. The next era of the books. So it's interesting looking back on these as this epic journey. And of course, it was only 6 years long. That's the funny thing about it. So much went on in 6 years. But the books were so long. The books are 80,000 words, and there was 11 or 12 of them per year. So that was a lot of ground to cover. And even I didn't read them all. I know some people did read them all as they went along, and I envy that, really. I wish I hadn't dipped out in the mid-90s. I had to catch up a lot, and I still haven't caught up, but that's the nature of Doctor Who. You can always double back and go back and revisit because it's time, isn't it? I'm going to stop there. I will see you again in the next episode. Goodbye.